All right.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Looks like we've probably still got a few folks dropping in, but we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's learning session on community-centered fundraising. My name is Tessa Whitlock. My pronouns are she, her, and my role at the ACH is supporting our development work and bringing more investment into our region. The song that we heard playing at the beginning there is called Ocean Child I Am by the band Kuik, and we'll drop the link in the chat there for anyone who wants to continue listening. And really appreciate everyone who has been sharing names, pronouns, organizations in the chat. Please continue to do that. We love knowing who's in the room with us. So as folks come in, please keep adding to that. And first, we'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. And especially given the topic that we're discussing today, I just want to be sure to uplift how much we can learn from Indigenous traditions of giving and reciprocity. And we have a list here of group agreements that we use for our meetings that we're going to ask folks to stick to today. The first is to spread kindness. We don't know what others are carrying, so please make sure to extend kindness to everyone in the space, including yourselves. Learn to disagree without breaking. There may be points we don't agree on, but we want to find ways to explore that without othering each other or breaking. Allow for being uncomfortable as a part of growth. We want this to be a brave space where we can learn new perspectives and new ways of thinking. Create opportunities for follow-up. Given the fact that our time is always limited in meetings, there may be some things that come up that we don't have time to explore, but we're always open to continuing the conversation after these sessions. Make sure that we're speaking from our own experiences, sharing from a place of I rather than they. Use language that is respectful, accessible, and inclusive. And respect the privacy and confidentiality of what is shared here. Obviously, we hope that you'll share out the concepts and ideas that you learn here today, but any personal stories that are shared, please make sure you have permission before you share those outside of this space. And then next, a few Zoom options for you. So for sharing questions, you'll see the Q&A button in the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to be monitoring the chat for questions, but just to help us make sure we can track those and they don't get lost, if you drop them in the Q&A, that is super helpful for us. And then there'll be a few opportunities where we'll be inviting you onto conversation. So feel free to use the raise hand function there to let us know that you'd like to speak. And if you need assistance with any of the tech or have questions at any point during our session today, feel free to either raise your hand. You can also look at the participant list. All of the ACH staff on the call have a little star by their name. So feel free to also message any of us and we can help you out. If you're comfortable and able, we do encourage you to keep your camera on, just makes it easier for us to connect in the room. And please do take care of yourself. Take breaks as needed. We're here for 2 hours, so step away if you need for refreshments, for bio breaks, whatever you need, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And this meeting's being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again after the fact. So that sometimes makes it a little easier. Don't have to worry about taking notes. You can come back and watch this, and we'll also be sharing out a bunch of additional resources, any resources that are mentioned in the session today, and then some other ones. Most of you are probably familiar with the network and the resource library, but for folks who aren't, the network is our collaborative learning and action group. So it's open to individuals, organizations in our community. And these learning sessions are one part of the work we do with that group. And the resource library is a great place. There are resources for all of our other learning sessions and a ton of other great stuff there. So if you haven't checked it out, highly encourage you to do that. And just to give you a little preview of our time today, we're going to start with a little bit of grounding, kind of frame the conversation that we're going to have today. We will have a discussion with some wonderful panelists from our network. There'll be a time for some small group discussions to talk through what you've heard from the panelists and think through some action steps. Then we'll have time to come back, share those out, any other questions that you want to ask the panelists or each other, or discuss what was shared in the breakout rooms. We'll have time for that. And then we'll close and send you on your way with some ways to continue this work, carrying it forward. So with that, I would love to hand it over to my colleague, Emily, who will get us started with that grounding part.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tessa. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and my pronouns today are they, them. I'm a grant specialist at North Sound ACH, and I'm here to ground them today. We're going to start out with a Zoom poll. The question is, how familiar are you with community-centered fundraising? We'll be introducing the framework of community-centered fundraising and what that means, but we'd like to see where you're all at today. So I'm going to give just about 5 more seconds to answer the question. Great. So let's go ahead and close the poll. Let's see our results. All right. Wow. We've got a pretty good mix here today. Some folks just beginning to learn about this, about half that know a little bit, and then a good number of folks who either know a lot about it or love it. So I'm really excited for our session, our discussion today. And for everyone on this call, we hope that you leave with actionable takeaways and also a recognition and a lifting up of things that we're already doing to center community in our fundraising, resource mobilization, and philanthropy. Next slide, please. Before we can dive into a conversation about community-centered fundraising, we need to understand that there's a connection between nonprofit fundraising and philanthropy. And historically, this has led to a donor-centric model that has many limitations and drawbacks. Philanthropy means love of people or love of humanity. And these are our best instincts as people to help each other and to take care of one another. This is a long-standing practice among humans with a rich tapestry of examples from all over the world. Many indigenous cultures today have practices of resource sharing grounded in reciprocity and generosity. Potlatch is a local example of this. Potlatch is a Coast Salish system of giving, celebrating, and honoring through feasts and ceremonies. The more that a family gives away, the wealthier they are. And the meaning of wealth in this example is not monetary wealth or an individual sense of wealth, but the wealth of being able to give and share within the fabric of community. I think this is the through line between philanthropy, nonprofits, and fundraising. There are more than 1.8 million nonprofit organizations in the United States. And I want to give a shout out to people who do fundraising and grant writing. Please put your emoji in the chat or give a reaction if you do fundraising. We know that nonprofits are dependent on fundraising to be in existence. And we are so grateful for donations, for giving, for grants, for people who volunteer their time. And 42% of nonprofits report a lack of adequate finances and resources for their organization. So I want to talk a little bit about the historical context of philanthropy. Philanthropy as a word came into the American consciousness in the mid to late 1800s during the time of the Gilded Age, industrialization, and industrial giants amidst massive income inequality. Philanthropic foundations and the first nonprofits were established, and eventually a structure developed to facilitate the funding of the nonprofit sector. However, the idea of helping people who need help was driven by the opinions and perspectives of those who held the money, and this was an unequal system from the start. Here, I want to acknowledge the complexity of this topic and encourage you to go deeper after this session with some of the resources that we'll share and have conversations, learn from others, and add your voice into this important conversation. Something that I know that has really helped me is holding on to the reality that multiple things can be true at the same time. For example, as people, we want to give, and there are many good intentions in traditional philanthropy, but we exist in a power imbalance because nonprofits depend on external funding. A donor-centered model gets in the way of our intention, and here's some of the ways that that shows up. Number one, donors setting the priorities, when donors decide where the money goes and who gets it. Number two, it perpetuates the idea that philanthropy and the human services that it funds are optional. The problems that we seek to fix are fundamentally problems of income inequality, structural racism, and intergenerational trauma resulting from inequitable systems. Addressing these problems is not optional, and the communities who are most impacted also hold the solution. Number three, a donor-centered model tells us to focus on immediate emergencies and crisis management, in other words, downstream, instead of upstream structural change and investment in creating the vital conditions for well-being. Nonprofits, as wonderful as we are, can never sustainably take care of all of the downstream issues in perpetuity without there being structural change upstream. Fortunately, this isn't the only way. There are many, many untold stories of non-Western, non-white centered philanthropy. Next slide, please. I learned earlier this year that there were many, many Black philanthropists in pre-Civil War and Civil War times, often predating the philanthropic history that I just shared about, who invested millions of dollars in the 1800s. These leaders included James Fortin, Clara Brown, Tommy LaFawn, Mary Ellen Pleasant, John McKee, and Ida B. Wells. Many of them were also leaders in the abolitionist and anti-lynching movement. I love the story of Colonel John McKee, a businessman who made his fortune through real estate and owned properties in many northern states. He managed properties for newly freed Black people to rent, and upon his death, left $2 million to philanthropic causes. Examples of non-traditional fundraising include mutual aid societies and benevolent associations, educational initiatives, church-based philanthropy, giving circles and rotating credit groups, entrepreneurial philanthropy, advocacy, activism, civic engagement, and support for abolitionist movements, including historically the Underground Railroad, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, which ran from 1831 to 1865. And here we have a quote from Sonia Shields, who is the executive director of Cause Effective and an advocate for equitable fundraising. She says, "What's important to note is that for Black Americans, philanthropy was not optional. It was not an option. As Black Americans grew financially, they used their money, their resources, to free other Black people and provide opportunities to Black communities. Philanthropy was necessary for social change and racial justice." And that takes us to where we are today. A group of people who are committed to learning, advocacy, and collaborative action, here to learn about community-centered fundraising. So what is it? Next slide, please. Community-centered fundraising is a collection of practices that have always been around and that continue to be around and that have now coalesced into a global movement. CCF is both a framework and a movement, so you will hear me talk about it. The founding of community-centric fundraising happened in Seattle, and it was started through conversations of Seattle area executive directors, fundraisers of color, who got together to discuss how to change and evolve fundraising to align with equity and social justice. In August 2018, they held their first larger convening locally with about 90 fundraisers of color to explore and reflect on their lived experiences. After this, they formed the Seattle chapter of community-centric fundraising as a fiscally sponsored entity. And in May 2019, they expanded across the sector. Since then, they launched a website, a resource hub, and a blog that features essays and articles from fundraisers of color, and a Slack channel for community conversations and connections, which, by the way, I highly recommend that you check it out. There is now a global council made up of people of the global majority from around the world who are working to amplify and elevate these principles. I encourage you to go to the CCF website, which has been shared in our chat today, to read more about the founding story and also the acknowledgement from the founders of CCF about the decades of movement work and activism that inspired them and informed their efforts. I'd like to share now just a little bit about each of these principles, which I know we're going to be hearing more about in the panel discussion, but let's go through them one by one. First, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. This is especially important because, as we know, such a small percentage of philanthropic dollars actually make it to communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities. In addition, only 3% goes to people who are disabled, and 1 penny out of every $100 goes to trans folks. Number 2, individual organizational missions are not as important as the collective community. And we're going to be hearing a lot about this, I think, from our panelists today. It's one of my, I think they're all my favorite, but this one is definitely my favorite principle. Number 3, nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. This means telling each other about opportunities, writing letters of support, maybe proofreading a grant, or encouraging donors to give to your partners on Giving Tuesday. Number 4, everyone who strengthens the community is equally valued. Number 5, time is valued equally as money. This means lifting up volunteers who give their time and also lifting up staff who give so much of their time as well. Number 6, donors are partners. So we are transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. Giving feedback to donors is an important part of this. Number 7, we build belonging, not othering. Number 8, we help people understand that everyone personally benefits from the work of social justice. This is mutual benefit. It's not charity, and it's not a one-way street. Number 9, the work of social justice is holistic and transformative, not transactional. And number 10, we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. These 10 principles have been articulated as a starting place. They are iterative and they may look different at each organization. They evolve and change just like we do. I want to point out that you can be doing CCF in one area of your fundraising, not doing it in another, and that's okay. You might look at these principles or think about the examples and recognize things that you're already doing, and that's awesome. I just want to be real that we're all grappling with this and figuring it out together. So having spaces like this one where we can hear from each other, discuss, and think about what we might do next are so important. What's so exciting to me is that there are folks in our region who have begun to use DCF as a framework. I see more examples of this each and every day. And that's why we're here today, talking about this one area in fundraising and philanthropy where we do have control as both as fundraisers and as people who give our time, money, and talent. So I hope you are as excited as I am to hear from folks who are using this framework, who can give us examples and show us how they're putting it into practice. With that, I am going to hand it over to Tessa, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Emily. Well, it is truly my pleasure to introduce the panelists we have today. These are folks who are in our network, and we've had the opportunity to chat with about some of these topics in the past, and are just so excited to be able to share some of the work that they're doing out with a broader group. So we've got 3 panelists to chat with today. First of all, we've got Musu Bakoto Sawo from the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, Meriel Kaminsky, and Andy Basabe from the Vamos Outdoors Project. So I'll give brief introductions for everyone. Musu is the Director of Fundraising and Grants at the Community Foundation of Snohomish County. Musu is a feminist and human rights lawyer and defender with over 18 years of experience in children's and women's rights advocacy and activism, and over 10 years of leadership experience in program and policy development, advocacy, and fundraising. She has made significant contributions in nonprofit organizations and public institutions in the Gambia, across the African continent, and beyond. And in her current role, helps CFSC to center community voice and to co-create community change that prioritizes those who are most impacted. CFCS leads with intention and commits to developing an equitable and inclusive organization where all individuals and intersecting identities are recognized and honored. And Andy and Meriel joining us from the Vamos Outdoor Project. Vamos's mission is to build community through connection to the land and access to the outdoors. Vamos's outdoor and academic programs foster healthy habits, socio-emotional learning, and positive childhood experiences with Latine, multilingual, migrant, and newcomer students in Whatcom County. We are so grateful to have all of you here with us today. So I'll start off with you, Musu, if I could, and just invite you to share a little bit more about yourself that you'd like to, and especially your journey with philanthropy and fundraising, and how you view it now and how that might have changed over the course of your work.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm very delighted to share my journey with you. And I basically was involved in philanthropy and nonprofit fundraising about 13 years ago in my home country in the Gambia. I was actually 9 years old when I became a child rights activist and subsequently involved with nonprofit organizations in the Gambia. And it wasn't until 2011 when I started fundraising as a career, I would say. And then my earlier work primarily focuses on fundraising for a young feminist organization called Think Young Women in the Gambia. And in this role, I realized that a lot of the agencies that I worked with were UN agencies in the country, but also foreign diplomatic agencies like high commissions and the embassies who would grant organizations like mine at the time. But I realized that the relationship was very transactional. It was also a way of redirecting the focus of organizations to do what the UN wanted at the time or other agencies, rather than what the needs of the communities were, or even those organizations. And a lot of them, because they were desperate, would sort of like align their values with that of UN instead of the other way around, or any of the donors for that matter. So we saw a lot of great organizations losing focus because they wanted the money to be able to continue work that they were doing, but also ending up duplicating efforts, but also doing things that were not really the needs of their communities. But I would say that one of the pivotal moments of my life was when I now moved to the other side, where I did work with a UK based agency, and I was the in-country officer for them, and I was managing the grants. And like the UN, the interest was on what they wanted. This agency focused on supporting grassroots-led organizations across the African continent, and the Gambia was one of those countries that they had interest in. But when you think about FGM and what it was about, they came in with ideas of, what communities needed to do, what organizations needed to do. Again, I saw like it was very transactional, and the focus was not on building the capacities of these organizations, but rather giving them one-time funding just so they do work, and there's no institutional support, there's no room for growth for these organizations. And that for me was really heartbreaking. At the time, I didn't even know that it was called community-centric fundraising, but I knew that there was need to, redirect. And I started sort of like talking to the head office and saying, don't you think it's more important for you to build the capacities of these organizations, but also in the process, learn about the communities that they come from, be involved with the community, so that this is not just about donor, grantee relationship, but it also goes beyond that, where they know that you care really genuinely about the course of action that they were focusing on, but also that the communities that they come from, that there wouldn't be that power imbalance where they feel like the donor is the supreme leadership kind of, and that we must also do whatever it is that they wanted. And then I wanted it to be focused more on equity. I wanted it to be beneficial also for the nonprofits, because if you think about it from the UN agency perspectives, where they give money for the organizations to implement their in-country programs, that is a benefit for the UN, because it's a way of checking the boxes of whatever it was that they had set as far as milestones are concerned. But the organizations were not getting anything in return, no capacity, no institutional support, amongst other things. I wanted to change that for the organizations in my country, including the organization that I was a part of at the time. So now moving to the US and working with the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, and now knowing that there's actually a terminology for the things that I was really fighting to obtain in my country, where everything that we did would be rooted in justice, in equity, and also uplifting and empowering the communities in the process. So this concept really resonated deeply with me and has profoundly influenced my approach in how I fundraise. And even when I came to the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, I continued to do that because there was already something in place. The institution and its leadership was already grounded in that kind of work. So it was really something that resonated with me, and I wanted to continue doing that work. So my perspective evolved from just raising funds for an organization for the survival of that organization to saying sometimes even being considered a difficult organization, because there were many times that the organization that I was working with, I had said no to the money from all these big agencies because it did not align with our values. I felt that there was time for us to kind of shift the power to the nonprofits and be able to say, no, we're not accepting this money because it is not in the interest of our organization, because it doesn't align with our values, because it's not going to be beneficial to the community that we serve. And that has really it's been an incredible journey, and I'm so excited to kind of like continue doing that work, especially now that I find myself as the director of fundraising at this amazing organization, the Community Foundation of Snohomish County. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I know we'll hear more about sort of the specifics of your work there now. And it's so helpful to hear that context. And what a perfect illustration of what Emily was saying. This is stuff that folks have been noticing and pushing for and wanting to make change, and having those the terminology and the framework to kind of hang those ideas on can be really helpful. So really appreciate that. Well, Andy and Meriel, I'd love to pose the same question to you. So anything else that you'd like to share to introduce yourselves, your history with fundraising and how that might have changed over time?
I can start. My name is Meriel, and I have worked with Vamos for 4 years. I am of mixed heritage. I am Honduran and Czechoslovakian. And I started with almost 40 years ago, and pretty much 2 weeks into starting, I was writing a grant with Andy. It was at the time, it was just the two of us at Vamos Outdoors Project. And we were doing all of our administrative work out of a basement. And we were writing a $20,000 grant to Hydro Flask for our backpacking program. And since then, I've needed to play on all sorts of different fundraising roles within the organization, writing grants, running community events to raise funds. And I think for me, one of the things that has changed since I first started is really understanding the importance of general operating funds for both Vamos and for the nonprofit sector, which I'll probably speak to this a little bit later on, but how the relationship between donor and kind of grantee, there needs to be trust there, because really what has allowed Vamos to have an office space, to grow, to be able to serve more students, is general operating funds, is grants, is donors trusting that we are doing the work, that we are able to best serve the communities that we serve. And we are a team of 8 leadership team members. I'm one of them, but we have a whole team of us that are all working collaboratively to do the work of Vamos. And I think when I first started, maybe too, was the grants that we had access to or that we knew of at the time. But we were really focusing on program-specific funds, but realizing that we needed funds to be able to sustain ourselves as an organization and create a space that we can invite families to.
Thanks, Phil. Always the memories, Meriel, when you go back to the basement days. My name is Andy Basabe. I'm also a member of the leadership team at Vamos Outdoors, our office kitty. And I've been with Vamos for 6 years. And yeah, at the very beginning, fundraising was a huge part of figuring out how we were going to function and operate. And Meriel and I, in the basement days, had a lot of time to envision sort of how we wanted to do things when we weren't quite so busy with all these administrative tasks of a larger organization. We could discuss things, and a lot of the things that we came up with initially, and I'll get into more examples later, but even things such as our pay structure, to figure out like how do we want to equitably set up a pay structure within an organization, because we saw a lot of nonprofits where we didn't want to perpetuate some of the same pay dynamics. And then funders are like, we can't do that. And it's like, all right, we're trying to do something cool here that we think is helpful, and getting pushback from the very beginning. And over time, it's been nice to see those conversations change through community-centric fundraising, like seeing how that has trickled through donors and funders. And yeah, we'll talk more about it later, but yeah, fundraising is something that's really important for nonprofit work, and it's also really challenging because of all of those dynamics.
Yeah, I really appreciate you speaking to some of those. And yeah, hearing how this fits in with sort of other efforts you're making in your organization and just that general culture at your organization is really interesting. And Meriel, also really appreciated you speaking to how they're sort of in this framework, there are aspects that are values, right? That trust is so important. And that there are also really concrete things like general operating support that can be an expression of that trust. And so really thinking about it both in those sort of higher level theoretical ways, but also like, what does that actually look like in practice? So really appreciate, I know we'll get into that more with some other questions, but really appreciate you raising that right off the bat. Thank you. Well, we'll hop back to you, Musu, if we could, for our next question here. So I'm wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about what community-centered fundraising means to you. So both, again, sort of both in that values-based way, what does that look like? But also if you have any specific examples that you can share of what that work looks like. And please feel free to share wins and challenges. As Emily shared in the beginning, we're learning this, we're figuring it out. And it's really helpful both to hear places where folks have figured out how to do this and also where we're still learning and growing.
For me, when I think about community-centric fundraising, it's basically centering community, whether it is the nonprofits or the actual communities that they serve and work with, and prioritizing their needs, aligning the donors' values to theirs, because there can be a misunderstanding that the donor knows best. And in that process, there's a lot of value that is lost as far as what the community brings on the table. So for me, community-centric fundraising is basically rooted in equity, race, depending on where you find yourself. Because in my context, for example, race was not much of an issue, but rather like it was the justice component of it and the power imbalance that existed. But coming into the US and being in this work, race is very much rooted in that as well. Of course, in addition to equity and justice. So for me, centering communities and prioritizing their needs, valuing the work that they bring in and the knowledge that they bring in, but also being trusting that they know what they're doing and that they would put that money into good use. And even if it is not money, because there can be a confusion that fundraising is always about money. It's not. It's also about building those relationships. And that would even be as simple as, going on site visits and learning, caring about what these communities do, what these organizations do. I think there is value to that. Yesterday, I went to one of the nonprofits that we work with, and they invited me into their space, and I went in there and we realized that the sense of fulfillment that I got, the fact that I had even that opportunity to be in that space, I couldn't have learned about all that work on a Zoom call. It would have been just easy to be on a Zoom call, but knowing that maybe going into their own space and seeing them in action, there is something you get from that. There's something you get from them when they tell you their story that you can't get from a regular Zoom call or even a phone call or an email exchange. So for me, community-centric fundraising really centers around that. And working with the Community Foundation, I think one of the things, our priorities is to simplify our grant. Recognizing that, English is not everyone's first language. And I remember when we had this prep call, I talked about my own experience of, going to school and realizing that we actually speak in the passive voice, which in our context is very much, fine, but moving to the US and knowing that, they speak in the active voice. And British English can be different from American English, as we have discussed, where some terminologies mean differently in the US. So just knowing that and my experience in that alone has been able to kind of like enable us as an organization to streamline the way in which our grant questions are such that even those who are non-English speakers would be able to express themselves, but really also bring into the attention of the committees that preside over these grant applications and make decisions that it's not about how well an organization is able to tell their story, because there is an unintentional bias in that, because bigger organizations are able to afford grant writers who can write these beautiful stories of organizations. What about local nonprofits who don't have the resources to be able to hire a professional to do that? So then our focus now centers around, like the substance of the grant rather than the language that is being used or romanticized to convince, a funder to give you the money. So that's one of the things. But also, in addition, we've really been prioritizing community, in the sense that if you look at the 1555 that we have, which is 15 BIPOC-led organizations who would be given funding, $50,000 funding for a period of 5 years. How did we get to that? It was the organizations themselves, after we had focus group discussions with them and surveys, that they were like, we think you need to, this is the way in which you can support us, sustainable funding. So giving them 5 years of unrestricted funding for a period of 5 years could only change the ways in which these organizations operated, because for a lot of them, they're really small. They don't have access to unrestricted funding. So to be able to have that in order to elevate their programming, I think that is also another way in which we recognize and center our work around community-centric fundraising. But also, there are other examples like our APA grants. Usually, our grant process is very simple, but we needed to reach a compromise and took government money to be able to support nonprofits who would likely not have gotten the money from government, because it's reimbursement based. That would mean an organization needed to have money in their bank accounts. If they don't, getting that fund, the grant is impossible for them to implement. So at the foundation, we have the two APA grants, one on the youth mental health and one on senior services, where we're telling organizations, this is unrestricted. You get this money, 30,000 for one, 50,000 for another. You can use it operational cost, all the costs that usually traditional grants will not give you. So this is available to them. But what is beautiful about the APA grants is that the committee that presides over that grant to make decisions are actual members of the communities, organizations with expertise, individuals within the community whose work is rooted in racial justice and equity are the ones who are making this decision. So you'd realize that community-centric fundraising would also include, in the grant process, giving community power to be able to say, yes, these are the activities that we think our communities would benefit from, and we're saying yes to that. Not just on the part of the donor where the committees decide, but having the committees composed of critical members of the communities that we work in. I think that is also something that is quite outstanding, because in that process, it kind of removes those barriers of traditional or local nonprofits not being able to access. In terms of challenges, I think I think one, before the challenges, I think it's also important, even within the concept of community-centric fundraising, to also be able to build the capacities of organizations. And at the Community Foundation, we very much do that. For example, I support nonprofits with writing their grants if they don't have the capacity to do so. I do that in multiple ways. I can help them review the grants. I can co-write the grant with them. And sometimes when they don't have that capacity at all, I can write the grant for them and pass it on to them to review, accept whatever it is that they want, and to leave that, but also providing them with technical workshops that the foundation does. As far as challenges are concerned, I think my experience has been, there's a lot of, to try to overcome like the traditional power dynamics that have already existed in philanthropy, where the funders are always right. To try to change that and shift that can be a bit of a challenge. But I am an optimist, and I believe that because the organization that I work with, the leadership is very much interested in this work and grounded in it. They make it so easy for me that I feel that there is a possibility for us to be able to achieve that. But also, I've realized that, say, for example, we had a grant process that just ended, and a lot of traditional big organizations that may have been getting the funding over the years who didn't receive it, I kind of like feel I got emails from them, some pleasant because they wanted to know why, like areas in which they could improve, and we provide feedback to organizations. But then there was some that the language was automatically very defensive. It's like, why didn't we get this funding? And we have been getting it for a very long period of time. And I feel that because smaller organizations have been given that opportunity, there could be a possibility of tensions, for example, where these traditional organizations or who have been more privileged in terms of receiving funding are seeing that they're not getting as much funding that they used to, and it's now going to smaller organizations, then there is that possibility for tensions to rise. And that's not, of course, the spirit within which organizations are operating. But I think also when we think about the wins of centering community, it's very significant, because then giving them that voice that they need, trusting them and knowing that they really know that they're the real experts and we are just working with them. I think that is something that is quite uplifting, not just for those of us who are fundraising, but also those communities themselves. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And yeah, especially really appreciate you talking about that challenge. And I think that speaks a lot to one of the things that I think can feel really tricky about this is it can feel really tricky to do this as one organization or as one individual without that broader community change. So it makes a lot of sense that you're encountering organizations who are still in that place of that scarcity mentality, because that is the system we're in. And so I think that's something that we're really hopeful with, even just starting this conversation today about this being a really, our whole region trying to have these conversations and implement these practices, because the more folks are on the same page about it, the easier it gets. So really appreciate that. And oh my gosh, just like a laundry list of all the things we want funders to be doing, like just incredible work. And like at all levels, stuff that seems really small, but can be a really big barrier. And I want to especially just highlight, I think a lot of the work you're doing speaks so well to that principle that, an organizational mission is not more important. The way that you support your grantees, not just in your relationship with them, with your foundation, but supporting them, getting other grants, and your investment in them, showing other funders that level of trust and faith in their work. So really appreciate all those examples. Thank you. So Andy and Meriel, if I could turn it over to you. Meriel, maybe you could speak a little bit to what community-centered fundraising means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to thank Musu for your work of especially mentoring and co-writing grants, writing grants, understanding that oftentimes at small organizations, capacity is really difficult. When we're 2 staff or 3 staff, it was really difficult to be writing grants and running programs and running community events. And so I think that mentorship, and I'll also speak to this a little bit later, but mentorship is huge. And understanding that for, at least in Vamos's case, I was coming in new to nonprofit fundraising 4 years ago and having to learn. And so the first grants you, Musu, for all of the work that you're doing. I think for Vamos, a lot of us are new to nonprofit development work. And one of the moments that I had not too long ago was sitting with our local community foundation. And here there are 3 of us from Vamos sitting down with a funder of ours. And I have 4 years, a coworker of mine 1 year, another coworker 6 years. So being in this space where we're new to nonprofit development and getting to have this kind of interface time with a donor is, I think, one of the ways in which community is being centered in the work, because prior to kind of these meetings and even to my work at Vamos, I hadn't thought of myself of being in a fundraising space, and I needed to be, just because that was what was needed of the organization at the time. But being in relation with donors and then seeing kind of the shift of who is occupying these positions in the organization, I think is an important shift for fund seekers and for donors as well. So I think that's a moment that stands with me. And I think I spoke a little bit to the general operating funds, but if almost students come to our programs and they see themselves in participating in Vamos, it doesn't matter if they're doing mountain biking, doesn't matter if they're doing backpacking or rock climbing, they want to participate in Vamos, which is all the activities. So I think, Vamos has changed from just trying to, make ends meet by whatever grants can provide for individual programs to, okay, let's look for more general operating funds so that we can fund all of the programs, because that is in the end what the students we serve, that's how they see our work, and that's how we see our work. It's not just one activity, it's all of the activities. And Andy, I don't know if you have anything to add with this question. We kind of divided up the questions for the audience, so yeah, you'll hear from both of us.
Yeah, I think I'll just a tiny little tidbit for community-centered fundraising and philanthropy, and the meaning is like philanthropy and fundraising has a diverse history, but the way we interact with it is often centered through wealth, and a lot of the structures that set it up were for wealthy people to move their money in different places. And so grants are often, they cater to higher educated, higher resourced folks and organizations. But look, and then there's money set aside for people to process all of that, whether that be folks working at foundations or professional grant writers and things like that. But nonprofits need so many more resources than just money. Like that money is often what starts connecting to all these other resources. And so for Vamos, like looking at different ways we can bring community resources in, and that's in this, it's not often viewed as fundraising, but it's still the same sort of thing, like bringing resources in for us to support our mission. And so looking at how we can set up supporting families, cooking the food and paying them for our programs instead of contracting out with caterers or things like that, or figuring out ways to compensate volunteers, working to figure out how to support families when there's documentation issues, things like that, where like the money we have through this fundraising process can turn into resources. And that's something that's bigger than fundraising, but it's really important to think about that side of how community relates to all the funding.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, really, especially Meriel, that example of, I think that's such a powerful argument for general operating support, explaining to funders how the people who actually engage in your programs view the work itself. That's one of those like things where there's just that disconnect and understanding of how it really works for folks who are experiencing the programs themselves. So really appreciate that. Yeah, and Andy, if there's anything else to add in terms of specific examples, or for either of you, if there's any challenges and wins that you'd be up for sharing with us, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Meriel, I'll go first on this one because I got lots of my notes here. So some of the ways that we've seen community-centered fundraising play out in our organization and our practices, I'll share some of that. And like Meriel, I had never done grant writing or fundraising prior to Vamos, I think, except for like my mom and I filling out the FAFSA a long time ago. And so getting to jump right into that and figure out how to do it on one hand was nice because there weren't any boundaries, parameters telling us how to do it, but also we had to learn a lot. But some of the things that we've tried to bring into our processes in like working local events, like there's lots of businesses here in Kaminsky County that are supportive of Vamos and want to provide support for us through like a roundup campaign or monthly donations and things like that. And one of the things we've noticed is those are primarily white businesses that have like a history or awareness of formal philanthropy. And in recent times, we've put in a lot of effort to reaching out to a lot of our local Latina businesses to try to do those things. And we are totally aware that there's like a deep history of informal philanthropy through religious groups like diaspora, cultural practices like the Guelaguetza in Oaxaca and things like that that are continue to be practiced here. And it's all very informal. And a lot of the systems set up for formal philanthropy, which are things we have to deal with, like tax deductible donation receipts and W-9s and things like that, are often barriers for these practices that are happening in our community. And so working with Latino-owned businesses, restaurants, construction companies, things like that, talking to them, those are practices they haven't began in terms of like having someone who's part of their job is working with community partners for donations. And so bringing that conversation to the table and be like, if we want to include community in these processes, we need to do the work to support community members engaging in it the way that nonprofits have to function through all these legal processes. And so that's been something that's been really cool. Another thing is communicating with funders, just having those fun, sometimes difficult conversations about things we've noticed and learned. I don't know how it appears to all of you in the audience, but when you're reading grant questions, for me, it's usually pretty obvious whether or not those grant questions are written by folks who, are writing a grant that's going to cater to a traditionally educated, high-resourced organization, or they're right. You can see when there's questions like, oh, this grant is aware that different questions are needed to highlight the skills and expertise of community-based organizations or folks who are doing work in a different way. And like, just even as simple as how the questions are written, what they're asking is going to have a huge impact on who's getting that funding. And so having conversations between different state offices, whether it be the Employment Securities Department, Department of Commerce, the Recreation Conservation Office, of being like, hey, look, these are really great examples of questions that were asked in this grant. Could you please try that? And seeing how those conversations work. And I think that's something that, as folks get more experience with fundraising, it's really important to pass on that knowledge to fundraisers or to funders or other people who are making those decisions as to how money gets dispersed or even how it's offered. Meriel, maybe I'll switch into challenges and then pass it on to you. Some of the challenges that we've found that I think probably a lot of organizations that provide a bit more like basic needs services is access to wealth. Like all of us coming into Vamos are young. None of us have a background or like familial connections to wealth. And there's like so many nonprofits that are created to channel wealth. But like when we started looking at our fundraising events, they were young college kids coming to our events. We just recently had our first event where we had mostly older white people attending, and it was the most events or most highest donations per person than we'd ever experienced. And it's like, yeah, we've been talking about this for years and we've never been able to achieve it. And so for organizations that have access to wealth, that's a really valuable thing to have, but it's also something that is really important to share. And so when we have had access to that, it's often through a third party, like this event that I just referenced came from invitation from a volunteer to attend. And so we've also been invited to other galas, sort of, there's been some recognition of almost, but it's often feels like a check the box sort of thing. And then watching an organization raise more than our annual budget in a couple hours and then not introduce us to anyone, but have us be like part of the come check this out sort of thing, that's challenging. And we've asked other organizations like, hey, we have similar missions. Could you share our work or introduce us to some of your donors? Because we think some of them would probably appreciate being able to support Vamos. And we've never had that really be that offer being taken up. And I think that's something that large, well-resourced organizations would be really great for them to do, is to introduce their donors to other organizations, because that sort of mentality that it's a competition as opposed to just like making the pie bigger keeps us in this like scarcity mindset. And finally, like the relationship building and recognition of donor or funder relationships takes a lot of time. And if you're an under-resourced organization, or if you're the folks doing development or also running programs, it's really difficult to do that well. And if you don't have the investment to pay someone to do that, or you aren't able to hire someone who already has those connections and relationships, it's really challenging to get to that point where you're getting a lot of support from private philanthropy. Yeah. Meriel, pass it to you.
Yeah. So we touched on this a bit, but how especially the principle speaking to nonprofits are generous and with and mutually supportive of one another. I think a challenge has been sharing donors. And so that, and Andy spoke to that. On the opposite end, like a win or something that has come up of mutually supporting each other is mentorship. And when I started at Vamos, I met with a grants writer from another organization, and they shared with me, okay, this is how I organize my grants. These are grants that I think would fit Vamos. And that kind of work is incredibly helpful and gave me a space to walk into where I'm like, okay, I'm learning everything for the first time. At least I have a structure for organizing which grants I'm going to be applying to. And I have at least 5 grants on that list that I can apply to, because walking in for the first time and not knowing which grants, where to look, which foundations are in the area, it can be overwhelming. And so I think a win is supporting grassroots organizations, supporting our partner organizations in the process of building their nonprofit development sectors and the people that are in those roles. So that has been a win. And in that same way, I think supporting all staff and board in entering positions of decision-making positions of power that have to do with the finances of the organization. So Vamos has board members that are serving for the first time on a board, and that's really important. In the same way, we have members that are serving up for the first time in development roles. And so this kind of mentoring into roles and also making space for folks to be in those decision-making areas is really important.
Thank you both for sharing all of that. And really appreciate, especially, talking about the challenges. I think a lot of similarities to what you were sharing, Musu, when you spoke to this, of that, that need for a community around you when you're doing this work, right? That it can be so scary to be the one taking that first step and have the community maybe not be with you yet. And yeah, so we're really, really hoping that, that, folks who are here today and anyone else who listens to this in the future, that we can start building that community here, that we can really start changing some of those norms more widely so that it's not so scary and there's not that fear of losing something when you're making these changes. So really appreciate that. And of course, great. So good to hear about the wins, because that's the flip side too, right? Folks are doing this work and it's working out really well. There's that, you have to make that initial leap, but really, really appreciate hearing the successes that you're having too. Musu, if we could switch back to you for a moment. I would love to hear some practical advice that you might have for organizations that are thinking about doing this. And especially, I think another piece there that comes in the scarcity, and you've all certainly spoken to this, is that feeling of being alone as a fundraiser, even within your own organization. And that can be a lot to take on, making these big changes. So if there are ways that you've found to integrate this work into the whole team to make it a collaborative effort, to make the load a little easier to carry, any advice about that? But any advice on anything related to this would be very welcome.
Let's begin with maybe some practical advice in terms of organizations that have not fully transitioned into focusing on community-centric fundraising and would want to. I think being openly intentional about it, but also having the difficult and uncomfortable discussions and conversations with the donors. Donors can come in, for example, because they're bringing in money. They think they can be sometimes this thinking around, like a savior mentality where they think, oh, for example, I'm giving you one-time grant, or I'm supporting someone with a scholarship. And in that sense, they think they're making a significant support, sometimes almost heroic interventions in the lives of these recipients. First of all, that's not being very respectful towards that community, for example, because there's a lot of things that surround that individual and their community, for example, that maybe a $1,000 scholarship is not able to remove those systemic barriers and issues that individual and their community faces. So as an organization, really, to be able to check the privileges of your donors sometimes, even though it's uncomfortable, is one of the ways in which we can openly accept and transition into community-centric fundraising, where we're like, there is mutual respect, there is mutual understanding, we're aligning our values in the interest of the communities that we work with, but also the other nonprofits that are doing that work. And I also think sometimes, and I've seen this in at the foundation, for example, where we would be at a meeting and a donor would come in and say, I want to open a new fund with the organization. And the most popular one is scholarships. For some reason, like scholarships are like their go-to thing. I want to start a fund, but a scholarship is what I want to create. They come with these eligibility requirements that once you go through it, you realize that they are targeting individuals who look like them, not the community that we work in. At the foundation, it's clearly made known, like, this is not how things work. Here is what we think you should do. For example, having a specific extracurricular achievement, also having really high GPAs, knowing fully well that even though this is well intended on the part of the donor, but those requirements exclude historically marginalized groups. For example, if you require that someone needed to have a 4.0 GPA, you're basically excluding a certain group of people who come from those historically marginalized communities, people who come from low-income communities will not be able to get in, even though it's not like they're not good enough. But that requirement does not target those groups. And you can immediately see that as you go through the requirements. And as an organization, one of the things that I've seen is the leadership saying, no, that's not going to work. No, that's not going to work, because having a GPA requirement would mean that those who did not really go to well-resourced schools would likely not get that. And even if they did, there is also a likelihood that other students who will not even end up getting any of that support. If we want to be able to bridge the gap in terms of low income versus high income families, we're not able to do that if their children are consistently not able to reach their highest potentials because they don't have access to scholarships that would have enabled them to perhaps get access to higher education, and then from there get great jobs and be able to change the dynamics within which their communities were operating on. So in order to factor all of these things in and recognizing that, well, just having that eligibility requirement that is so stringent that it's very specific, it's known that it specifically targets a group of individuals, then you are taking away opportunities from other communities who could have benefited from that scholarship. So rather than just accepting that because you felt that, oh, we would still be able to get administrative costs, being able to check that donor and be like, hey, I think this eligibility requirement is discriminatory. It excludes communities that we serve. And as a result of that, we think you need to take this other approach. And you'd be surprised, a lot of times these donors or even funders are not aware. They're totally unaware of those privileges or those biases even. But you being able to just mention it without fear that the funding would go elsewhere. If the funding goes elsewhere, good for you, because you don't need that anyway. We should not be so desperate that we would not be able to check people who are people of power, who have authority, who have the potentials to change things if we don't bring it to their attention. Not that we should patronize or baby anyone, but I think that it is sometimes based on the experiences that we've had working in these communities, our knowledges of communities, amongst other things. I think just being able to bring that on the table changes a lot of things. And I've seen that happening. And having leadership, as far as how can we change things within organizational levels? If I came to the community foundation and found leadership that had no interest in CCF, there was no way I would thrive. It's two things. I deal with it, or I resign and move on to something else. So there has to be leadership that is willing to intentionally bring these things on the table and care about the work that you do. Because I saw that in both Angelique and Carrie. And I think, like I said earlier, that has made my work so much easier and want me to do more. And just speaking to them generally, because they have more awareness as far as how things operate within the US, because I'm still finding my footing within this space, even though I have a lot of experiences outside of the US. Just having that guidance from them, if that didn't exist, I don't think, like we would do anything. But also a lot of organizations would be like, or even donor organizations, oh, we consulted community, but you only consulted community at the end of your proposal submission rather than engaging them from the beginning. It's important that when we talk about centering community, that we bring them from the get-go, but not when everything is established, because if they came in and contributed anything, you've already committed to something that would not really change. So it's not, we should move away from the thinking of checking things off the box. Oh, we did consult them. No, consult them prior to analyzing or initiating the project idea itself. Sell it to them like, this is what we want to do. What are your thoughts? Then you would be able to get everything that you need to be able to comprehensively put in place plans or projects that would be of interest to the communities. But also building relationships, like I said earlier. Oh, we're just giving you money, that's it. No, build that relationship so they know that it's not just transactional, but also being flexible with, they've talked a lot about operational costs. You would see grants that mainly support programs, but then nothing else. So to be able to shift those, the thinking from, oh, we're just providing you with project-based support rather than things that would also include operational costs. I think that is a way, and also being flexible with the funding. Maybe the needs of the organizations have changed after they've received the money, to be able to be flexible to say, okay, this is no longer the needs of the community. How about we now use it to what the community needs right now, rather than being stringent on, oh, this was what we agreed on and we cannot change it. I think when we are flexible with the ways in which we grant, but also, like we resource some of these funds, I think that would be very interesting. Again, going back to working with your team, I think if you have a shared vision, you're almost on the same page. But also just like checking in with one another and be like, hey, I'm thinking about A, B, and C. What are your thoughts? I think just having that kind of relationship with your colleagues, so it doesn't feel like you're in competition with one another, I think that is something that can be really helpful. But when people tell me, oh, there's a lot of scarcity in terms of funding, I'm like, I'm an optimist. I'm not going to think about the obstacles. Rather, I'll think about what exists right now and ways in which one could navigate to access that, rather than focusing just on what does not exist. We would deal with that when we get there. But for now, we would immerse ourselves into what exists, be joyful as we try to fundraise for our communities, as we try to enhance ourselves, but also in this process, take care of yourself. That is one important thing, because there's a lot of expectations that are on people who fundraise, people who run organizations. There is a lot of expectations, and that pressure sometimes result into people not taking care of themselves, not being able to prioritize. You can't pour into someone else's cup if yours is empty. So in that process, take care of yourself. So in the wholesomeness of your being, you would be able to do all these amazing work for your community, for yourself, but also for the organization that you work with. I'd like to close with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Musu, and really appreciate you closing with that point. That's so important to bring up. That, yeah, this is hard work and we need to be taking care of ourselves first. So really appreciate that. And so wonderful to hear those examples of where you're finding those places where, where funders have that role to push back on donors. Your example of the scholarships, so that it's not then the scholar who's applying and having to navigate those requirements, or, with donor advised funds, so that it's not the grant applicants that have to push back. So really appreciate those places you're finding to use the foundation's power on behalf of folks who will be involved further down the line. Appreciate that. And Andy and Meriel, I'm wondering if you would close us out with some advice. Again, love to hear about sort of how this looks on your team, but advice about any of the work is great.
I think a concrete example that I would like to leave the audience with is mentorship. So if you see yourself in a space that isn't representative of communities served, it is like your responsibility to mentor someone into your role, and not do the work not continue to just have the work being done by yourself. I think, and two, that goes, as you learn more, to share that. I think, I sometimes think, wow, well, I'm still new and I'm learning. I'm new in nonprofit development work, but I've learned some things over the past 4 years. And so I can also be a mentor. And so thinking really broadly as far as mentorship, but really it is our responsibilities to mentor others into our role so that we are really representative of communities served. So that's one of the really, I think, concrete ways when I was thinking about this presentation that I want to share with everyone and in Vamos and in the work that we do as well. Andy, I know we have more points here, but you have a few for practical ways, so I want to give you space.
Thanks, Meriel. One, in thinking about my journey and the practical things that helped me, when Vamos started, a close mentor of mine, who's now a board member, told me to read Nonprofit AF, the blog, and I started doing that. And essentially at the beginning, just did what was written on that blog, and that was kind of the guiding light for a long time. And then also reading the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. There's a lot of really deep and critical conversation going on in there. And I think for me, kind of understanding things at that level really helps conversations, especially with folks who operate at a really high level, to highlight some of the struggles that are ongoing in the nonprofit sector. And then the other one is that change requires relationship building. Like, there's lots of times when it's best to just, like Musu said, just like check someone's privilege to provide, just give that feedback. But oftentimes when change is something that happens over time and requires trust and relationship building, and those soft skills are super important when working with community partners and funders, for them to open up to new ideas. And so when we have time to bring that humanity into work and connecting with people, it goes a long ways.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. And sharing those resources. It looks like we were able to share those in the chat. So if those are new to folks, do be sure to check those out. Those are great resources. Thank you, Andy. Well, we've got just a couple minutes before we're hoping to move to discussion. So I just wanted to make sure to make space if there's anything that you were wanting to share that you haven't had a chance to yet. Anyone's welcome to jump in, but we also know we want to have plenty of time for discussion. Okay. Awesome. Well, we're hoping that everyone will be able to stick around, and when we bring folks back from breakout rooms, some more questions may come up then. So we hope you'll stick around. And just want to thank all of you so much for everything you just shared. We feel really grateful to have you all doing this work in the community. So thank you for everything you've given us to discuss here. And I will hand it over to Emily to talk us through the breakout rooms.
Okay, awesome. Wow, that was such a rich discussion. I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, everything that was shared. Love seeing the different questions and comments coming up in the chat. And I'm going to send us to breakout rooms here in just a moment. But I wanted to point out that we have a Mentimeter set up. So if you're familiar with Mentimeter, you might already know. If not, it's pretty easy to use. You can do it a couple ways. One way is to scan the QR code that's on the slide right now. Will take you into this. Or you can go to the link, menti.com, and enter in the code. And that will take you to, essentially, it's like a whiteboard where you'll be able to add in thoughts that you have while you're having your discussion so that we can capture those and share out with each other. So the group discussion questions that we have today are, firstly, what strategies and practices that you heard today resonated with you? And secondly, what next steps can you take to practice community-centered fundraising, and who can you collaborate with? All right, so we're going to have about 15 minutes for the breakout rooms, and Natalie will be sharing out some reminders about the timing so that we're not caught by surprise when we come back. So hope everyone has a great breakout room session. Welcome back, everyone. We'll give a couple minutes for everyone to join back in from our breakout room. Great, wonderful. Well, I hope that it was a rich and fruitful discussion that was had in the breakout rooms. We have set aside some time today here towards the end of our session to facilitate sharing, and we have the opportunity to take a couple of additional questions from the audience for our panelists. Unfortunately, Musu needed to drop off the session today, drop off the call. However, Meriel and Andy are both still here with us. So I'm curious if we could open this up, if there's anybody who would like to share from their breakout room. What are the things that resonated? What are some of the next steps that you talked about that you're excited to take?
Question. This is Vesla from Washington Family Engagement. I'm wondering if the folks from Vamos would be willing to share just a little teaser. I'm sure it's very complicated, or more for this space, how you have structured the governance in your organization to make decisions about which grants you apply for, and how you is it rough consensus? Is it full consensus? Are you voting? A little bit of that information.
Give it a shot. Is that cool, Meriel? So we have a consensus model, and like written into that, which is always sometimes harder to do in practice, is that folks, like if you consent or are in favor of it, it's not a vote, but it's like if someone has a dissent, then like how do we address that? And so we have weekly meetings every Friday where all members of the leadership team are present, where we like, hey, this is an opportunity, this thing came up, what do we think? And then if folks have something to say, then how do we address that? Or if someone's like, no, this doesn't seem like a good idea, it's like, okay, cool, let's talk about it. The like thing with like mentorship and stuff that Meriel mentioned is that it's sometimes hard with the pace of our work for everyone to have the same level of information about things to have informed and empowered decisions. And so that's like a challenge of balancing time and 8 or 9 different people working in different realms, being able to make those decisions and have that consensus model. And that also came from Nonprofit AF as well, that like the writing behind that structure. But Meriel, what's your take? Can I throw you in there if you want to share anything else?
Yeah, I think for context, Vamos works as all of us who work full-time year-round. We are a part of the leadership team. We all hold decision-making, a voice in the decisions of the organization. And so we are structurally like a non-hierarchical organization. And so those Friday meetings are when we come together and make decisions about grants, about programs, about everything that has to do with the direction of the organization. And so we have a way of all of us keeping up of all of the week's to-dos, asking questions. Each person gets heard and is able to voice questions, anything that they would like to comment on as well. And then we go into, okay, what are the discussion topics that, each of us raised, or sometimes, I might not have something that I want to raise, but I want to hear about something that another coworker did. So that's kind of how we work. And then we come together, we share the opportunities that are available, the programs, whatever's on our minds, and come together to make a decision about what is the direction we'd like to go.
Thank you.
I think that's really wonderful to hear about the intentional process of decision making that comes with, deciding if an organization is going to apply for a grant or not, or I can see that relating to so many different aspects of nonprofit, like structure, activities, and the governance side of things. But what it makes me think of is how sometimes things can be moving so fast, and the sense of urgency can be so real that it, it's hard to take enough time for those things. And I know some nonprofits have found success with setting up like criteria ahead of time around whether an opportunity is going to be aligned for them and needs of their community, or have set up some structures to help with guiding to make sure that they're not shifting from what the community needs to what the priorities of the funder might be, or where the flashy opportunity is available. So thank you for sharing about that. Really appreciate hearing about what that looks like in practice. We have had some other comments here in the chat. One group talked about what is sustainable, and that question is really hard to answer. It would be nice if there was a definition of what is considered sustainable. I totally agree. Meriel, Andy, I think Musu may have also joined back in with us. Like to offer that question up to you, like what does sustainable mean to you, or how do you approach answering that question when filling out a grant application?
It's usually the last question on a grant, and it's usually when I'm like trying to be done with it, but also just like over time, I'm just like, yeah, we're going to apply for more grants next year, and we hope you continue to fund us. Like there's no other answer that is real on the Vamos side of things, but there is a lot of internally like sustainability and how do we invest in ourselves to be able to continue to get grants. But like that external answer, yeah, more of what we're doing right now, writing grants, and to expect us to do something different isn't realistic.
I agree. It's a very difficult question. What is sustainable? Because it's not we're not going to have to use a cookie cutter approach to say this is what is sustainable for everyone. For some people, what is sustainable would be like Andy rightly mentioned, continue to give us multiple funding for a long period of time rather than just saying, oh, this year we're going to give you this money and that's it. Then what happens to the programming? That would mean the organizations would have to try to look for funding elsewhere. So sustainability would be, okay, what's your intended plan of running this program? How does that fit within your community? How does that fit within your priority? And a donor making a commitment that, okay, for the next 5-6 years, we're going to be able to consistently give you that funding so that you can continue to do that great work and not have to worry about doing it, but using the time to work on other things as far as implementation is concerned. And sustainability could also be multiple funders coming in and saying, hey, we're going to support this initiative, because I think there's a lot of value in collaborating, especially on the parts of the funders to say, we're going to come together and jointly fund this program and not having to worry about, applying for multiple grants at multiple institutions just to be able to run their programs. But sustainability also means that those relationships that you're building, that you don't say, for example, get a government funding that will provide you funding for 2 years and then they leave you in the den to have to fend for yourself. Like, that is ridiculous and it is crazy. So sustainability would also mean being able to support long-term projects beyond the short term. But yeah, again, it's a difficult question. And in my view, I think it's dependent on an organization and what the sets of priorities would be at any given time.
Hi, this is Jackie. Thank you. One of the things you shared came up in our group where we talked about what was needed is commitment for long-term funding. But I think you hit a lot of things that are needed, because we definitely need a multi-pronged approach to address the inequities. And one of the things that I've been actively researching is had an opportunity. So we're a grassroots organization, and one of our partners, Fred Hutch, do some cross collaboration with some folks at Morehouse. So they have been incorporating community in like their grants. And so how they're set up and structured is they have like an advisory board as an organization. And they have, it's a community-based participatory research like process that's like they're involved in the decision making. They're involved in like, researching like their grants. They're involved in like, deciding like which grants, they're going to collectively want to apply for. But another thing in building in terms of like identifying like the grants that I have found is like happening and organizing. I know in partnership with North Sound ACH and Community Foundation of Snohomish County specifically, is that our funders or our partners are strategizing to meet the needs, to identify the gaps, because there's so many competing priorities and gaps of supporting folks to find like the intersections of where does their work intersect, how do we build on that, support that in short-term goals, long-term goals. One of the things that we're looking to doing in setting up a model for sustainability in future is incorporating. We do a lot of advocacy around civil rights, social justice, but in that like needing sustainability for the folks doing the work. And so we've been incorporating a lot of like healing coaches and practitioners in our work. And I think like that's something to like build upon and expand in terms of inviting folks that are going to be the health practitioners of like a project, whether it's in supporting internal or external staff, and part of this decision making when applying for like large grants. So I appreciate you all sharing your experience.
Thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate you sharing about that. We do have just a couple more minutes for this portion before we wrap up, and I wanted to make sure to mention a couple of the questions that were brought up in the chat earlier during the panelist time. one of these questions was, I'm curious if the various ACHs across the state are utilizing any community-centric fund distribution methods. Is this a priority or possibility for the ACHs? This is a great question, and I think I can just quickly speak to this one a little bit. It definitely is something that we're thinking about that's important to us. How can we incorporate these principles into our own work day to day? And one example for North Sound ACH is through the Network Review Committee, which is a community-based participatory grant-making decision sharing structure. So the members of the review committee come from our partners, come from our community, and they're the ones who read the applications for funding and discuss and then make decisions about how that funding will be allocated. And I know that some of the other ACHs have similar processes in place. There's always more work to be done. If anyone on this call has like specific ideas for things we could do, please send them our way, either to myself, to Tessa, or to our general team email, because we would love to hear from you and to talk more about that. Another question was, we're curious if there are currently meetings among community foundations that discuss community-centric fundraising across counties. This is one that also in our North Sound region, we are working on building up the opportunities for the community foundations from the North Sound region to talk to each other and to share practices, share resources, and also, talk about ways of replicating things that work. And Gary, who is with the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, has also added in that the community foundations meet across the region. Thank you, Carrie. And just had a presentation from Michelle Murray, one of the co-founders of Community-Centric Fundraising. That's awesome. Great. There is one more question here in the chat. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but this is a great question, which is, how does this movement square with the systemic issues of a tax code and legal system that favors wealthy people and companies using philanthropy as tax sheltering and control over communities? This is a great question, a big question. I'm wondering if either Musu, Andy, or Meriel, if you have any thoughts on that question, and also if there are ways that we can keep this conversation going after this session and keep connecting with each other and thinking about how to advocate for change in our sector.
Emily, would you mind reading the question again? I was getting lost in the comments and I apologize.
Sure, absolutely. So the question is, how does this movement square with the systemic issues of a tax code and legal system that favors wealthy people and companies using philanthropy as tax sheltering and control over communities?
Wow. I don't know that I have the answer. I think it's systems change. Andy, in one of the last questions that was posed to us as panelists was about how do we kind of break out of scarcity mindset? And Andy was going to speak to that point, but I think this question is a good one because we can be trying to do as much work as we can within the system, but there's the larger questions of how do we allow to there's kind of a perpetuation of wealthy being able to stay wealthy by the systems that are in place. So what is needed is a change of system. Andy, do we want to tag team this one?
Yeah, try to be quick. Couple of thoughts. One, like for foundations to increase the required annual giving rate would be really helpful, but also like it's beyond foundations because states and federal government provide grants, and the total dollar amount of those grants is way higher than what foundations give. but I also think like it's not just a sector thing, it's like a social class. There's just so many different ways to look at it because there are nonprofits that exist to perpetuate wealth or perpetuate the containment of resources within wealth. Like wealthy people can create a nonprofit to buy riverside property and make it so they can only go there instead of the entire community, and that's also a nonprofit that follows the same rules. And so there's like looking at it just as something that affects our sector. Like I think it's just something bigger that's like, how is wealth concentrated? And that's like a terribly difficult question for us to answer or do something about and feel empowered to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andy, Meriel. Thank you, Lars, for asking that. And I think the part of that answer starts with like having the conversations with each other and sharing these ideas. And like I said, hopefully we can keep this conversation going. I know we're right up at the end of our session time, so I'm going to pass it over to Tessa with so much gratitude for all of our panelists and everyone here. Tessa, can I hand it over to you to close us out today?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, thanks for those great questions and discussion. Thank you so much, Andy, Meriel, and Musu. So grateful for everything you shared today, and all the great work you're doing in our community. And everyone who joined us today, we talked a little bit about, how important it is when we're doing this work to have a community around us as well. So really grateful for all of you here forming that community. We'll be posting the recording to this and a bunch of other resources on our resource library, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, you can check out the recordings and resources from all of our past sessions. We have our next one coming up on November 20th and hope to see you there. And then last but not least, if folks have just a minute to fill out our survey, give us some feedback, we'd be so grateful. This really helps us make sure these sessions just keep getting better and better. So thank you for doing that. We hope we'll see you at future learning sessions. And also please do stay in touch with us and let us know how this work is going for you. We would love to hear from you. So thank you all so much.